Today, I am joined by Ben Bartee, a writer for The Daily Bell, and Nicholas Creed, who's an expert on corporate security. I'm Joe Jarvis, the editor of The Daily Bell. Today's conversation is going to be about AI and transhumanism, obviously a hot topic, but I found myself kind of a little wondering why people take such a negative view of it. Obviously, I can imagine any scenario in the future where AI goes rogue and ends up very terribly. I've seen Terminator. But to me, that's a little bit, regardless, it's still a tool that could be used to help people to be more productive. So I wanted to get the take of Nick and Ben, who seem to be a little bit more weary of both AI and transhumanism, another one of the topics, and kind of play devil's advocate a little bit and see, is this really a threat to humanity, or are the fears of this just a little overblown, like a lot of past inventions as well? So I'll just start by opening up to you guys and just trying to understand a little bit. What is it about AI? Let's start with AI. What is it about artificial intelligence that I don't know, is saying fearful of it? Is that even the right term?
Sure. Yeah, you could say that.
So what is it? What do you fear about AI for the future?
Well, okay. Let me start off by saying the whole COVID drama did a lot to shape my worldview. So I can kind of see some analogies between AI and COVID, specifically the mRNA shots that they marketed as vaccines that aren't really vaccines by any conventional definition. They literally changed the definition of vaccines in the dictionary in the US and probably elsewhere to meet, so that the mRNA shots could meet the definition of vaccine, whereas previously they wouldn't. That's a whole separate conversation. The analogy that I see is that you have this new piece of technology, mRNA therapy, whose long-term consequences are unknown, because there literally haven't been any long-term studies on their effects on people. Yet the authorities and obviously the companies that marketed them that have financial interest seem totally uninterested in even trying to find out what the long-term effects are and mitigating them if possible. So
Sure, I can see that. The first thing that comes to my mind is that that's a great reason to not force the mRNA vaccine on anyone. Is it a problem that mRNA technologies exist and that they're testing it in a lab? No, I don't think so. The problem is that it's being forced on people. So obviously I chose to wait and see what the long-term effects are. So far, since AI is not really being forced on anyone, I'm not sure I see the analogy there.
well, okay, in the nightmare scenario in which AI somehow gains consciousness. So by the way, that's another issue. Is I've been reading this book called The Science Delusion by a British gentleman with a funny name. It's like Rupert Sheldrake, I think is his name. And it's basically about like the hubris of science and scientists. And one of the things he talks about is that, biology, they've pretty much figured out all the mechanics of most of the mechanics, or at least what they know of the mechanics. Maybe there's probably a lot more that is underneath the surface that hasn't been explored. But the one thing they haven't even been able to begin to crack is consciousness, like where it comes from, how it works, how it's developed.
Even defining it, like what is consciousness? Yeah, I understand that.
Right. So, the danger that I would see in AI is not So like you're saying, the mRNA shots, no one has been forced to take them, which is arguable.
No,
But
I said people have been forced to take them, and which is the problem with them. Yeah.
But you're saying it wouldn't be a problem if people weren't forced to take them.
The technology itself being studied is not a problem to me.
Right. So, but the difference, so I know I made the analogy, but there is a difference in that, if AI somehow did develop consciousness, whatever that means exactly, like it developed its own free will, that would potentially, and it was powerful enough that would potentially impact everyone. You wouldn't be able to hide from it, for instance, if it became genocidal for whatever reason. So like theoretically, like, yeah, studying in a lab might seem harmless, but if you're looking at like the worst case scenario, it wouldn't be harmless for.
So I see this more as like a analogy for the gain of function research. So it's like, is it ethical to do that sort of research? Like, not really, because if it leaks from the lab, you're not just harming yourself. So I see that as a closer analogy. I guess I'd have to think about that. Nick, I want to hear your take. Are these the similar things that you worry about, or is it entirely different that concerns that you have?
Yeah, I've got a lot to say on the mRNA injections on the gene juice. I think that's more transhumanism, but I appreciate the context that Ben set out, because I also agree that COVID was the prerequisite necessary Trojan horse to enable the mission creep of AI, and how it's already being used in very nefarious ways by the state. So, for example, my biggest concern right now with artificial intelligence is, okay, let's take the January 6th incident in the Capitol. So they used geo-tracking of everybody's phone there, regardless of whether or not they were suspects, along with facial recognition from the CCTV cameras that they had. And this is already being developed and replicated and exploited all over the world. So the way I see it is, before we go down the rabbit hole of the extreme genocidal sentient AI, or the singularity when AI becomes more intelligent than humans, what we're looking at right now is, if we've got geofencing technology, and that doesn't even need to rely on tracking people's credit cards or their phone signals anymore. It could just be purely from facial recognition technology, plus the CBDC, the central bank digital currency, that looks like it's going to be rolled out on the back of this controlled demolition / engineered, orchestrated financial meltdown we're going through right now with SVB, etc. To me, that will enable the 15-minute cities, which they seem to be getting trialed out in the UK mostly. I don't know how much you guys know about that, but it's another World Economic Forum brainchild. So there's massive protests right now in Oxford, mainly in the UK, and they're calling them LTN, low traffic zones. So, for example, if I want to go and see my mate in zone 3, but I live in zone 1, through facial recognition cameras and scanning license plates, it will automatically know when I've left my zone, and then I'll get fined, and then maybe it'll affect my social credit score. So it will freeze me out of society if I do too many non-approved things. So AI
and this is
makes all this possible.
Okay, so the argument is that AI doesn't even require a human to do all the Orwellian oppression; it just makes it possible itself. But I'm not quite sure. Like, yes, that could absolutely that technology helps them do that. So do security cameras. So do a number of other technologies. I guess I'm confused about what's the difference is there a different, is there like a line that's been crossed with AI, or should, do we not want the government to have security cameras either? Which personally, I'd be fine with banning the government from having any technology. A bit of a anarchist myself, but you know what I'm saying here is that like, is the technology the problem, or is the government the problem? So
you're right. Yeah, I mean, I want to be careful to not be the person that rejects new technology in the same way that people used to downplay the internet, that it was never going to be a big deal. Because obviously it's not going away. It is going to revolutionize and change the world. So you make a good point. It's how the technology is used by bad actors. But then the more they find sinister ways to exploit it, to subjugate humanity and roll out all these globalist agendas, the more beautiful it is to see the pushback from the decentralized communities. Whether that's decentralized VPNs to get around firewalls, decentralized cloud storage, and there is open source AI, which I think has good applications. I understand the way it can make someone's job a little bit easier if it's drafting something. People are using it to write white papers for crypto. I understand that. But the other big problem I've got is I just see a society that's less and less connected to each other, a lack of spirituality, if you like. So ChatGPT, I heard one friend tell me last week that he's copying and pasting Tinder profile traits in Spain, and then he feeds it into ChatGPT and he says, write me a poem in Spanish, and then he just copies, pastes, and sends it to this girl. Right?
He must have watched South Park. Exactly. I was just going to say.
Right. So South Park then nailed it. And that's happening for sure. Right. So there'll be two people in a relationship thinking they're talking to each other. They're both feeding it to Chat GPTs. So are they in a relationship with each other? There's an AI middleman. That's very, very strange. But at the heart of it, I see a society losing their connection to nature and to each other, and becoming spiritually hollow. And I'm worried that the AI will make people more complacent, even less able to critically think. And then we've got the ChatGPT 4, which has just come out, and it looks like that's going to be a next level of propaganda, because apparently you'll be able to use it to create a movie without even hiring real human actors. So that immediately my mind went to, okay, we're going to have deep fakes on steroids, and we're not going to be able to tell what's real as far as video news goes. So that's in a nutshell, I think, my position.
Yeah. So then let's start from a baseline of, I guess, what that position leads to. Like, is there something you think should be done about it, or is this more of just a cautionary? Are you guys saying basically like, listen up, everybody, just be careful, when you're using this technology, these could be the unintended consequences, so be careful? Or is this more of like we need to, obviously I don't think either of you think that the government should be involved in regulating AI. I think we could probably all agree that that would just be, whenever the government regulates anything, it makes sure to advantage its own interests and disadvantage anybody that would compete with it. So I guess, is there a solution that you have in mind, or is this a general cautionary tale?
I was thinking.
Sorry, go
ahead. When I was thinking about it, I was thinking about this question, and it seemed to me that it's unstoppable. The AI revolution, it's too useful for too many things, and it will become more useful for more things and much more proficient at those things as time goes on. So it's not going to go anywhere. And if we try to like shun this technology totally, I think we're just going to end up, whatever holdouts, we're going to be like the savage on the reservation in Brave New World, like totally cut off from the civilized world or whatever.
Sounds kind of nice.
Yeah, it does sound nice, except it's hard to live in isolation like that. You know, with when you're right next to a much more technologically advanced civilization that regards you as like, at best you're like an oddity, and at worst you're like an inconvenience and an obstacle that needs to be somehow taken care of. The problem is always the application of the technology, not the technology itself. You know, like nuclear energy is a good example.
Right.
Like it's a great potentially it could be a great source of energy, but it's also potentially the end of humanity.
Nick, your thoughts?
Yes, I was going to say one solution is that it should always be open source. If there's an AI program that's going to be interacting with the public or in the public domain or in the hands of a government agency, for example, ChatGPT-3, as we saw from numerous articles, there were some really good ones on Zero Hedge, pointing out how woke it had been programmed to be by the developers. So it seemed like it was very reluctant to be critical of Biden or his son, Hunter Biden. And so if you can't see the code, you don't know how it's being manipulated. And that's a huge danger, because we've already seen like more and more news coming out of how bad actors tried to manipulate the election results in the US by creating a ridiculous amount of bot accounts. So I feel like that just could proliferate. But again, it's as Ben said, it's the application of the technology itself. I still think AI will have a place indefinitely. But how does that look in a decentralized society? If the decentralization and this parallel economy that we're also interested in collectively, the three of us, becomes so popular that the centralized planners crumble, you know, their institutions. And a friend of mine who works within coding, he had a really good point on the CBDCs. And he said that government coding and programs is often riddled with bugs because of the nature of it. And whereas, you know, a decentralized program it's run algorithmically, there's like a sort of democratic governance proposal. So that's how I would envision AI working for the people instead of against the people, if that makes sense.
So I totally agree that it makes sense to prioritize open source anything, because then you can basically check into the background. You know, Apple says that things are encrypted. It's closed source. Can't really check that out. You know, versus like Raspberry Pi devices, which you can program yourself as open code online that you can, you know, set up your entire smart home with it if you'd like, and have control over that instead of ceding that control to Amazon, Alexa, whatever tech company. So I totally agree with that. That's, to me, partially a market choice, and obviously we can't. The government gets involved in everything and will fund certain things, so it's not entirely a market choice. I realize that. So is that the creating a responsible consumer of AI, creating a responsible, you know, making sure that enough people understand it so that they can use it responsibly?
Yes, that would be a solution, but I mean, I don't have that much faith in the consumer, and I don't know how. Okay, so we all agree, I think, that we don't want the state in sole possession with, you know, its own, all of its own agenda, that's not shared with us. You know, it's not in our own self-interest. So if the state doesn't have control over this technology, like what mechanism is there to make sure that it stays in the public domain, or it stays open source? Because you have private interests, obviously, that would want to develop their own AI and wouldn't want to share it with anyone else. So like, I mean, this is the problem I have with that we've kind of talked about a little bit before with libertarian ideology in general is that, you know, there's like interest in keeping this stuff open source, but what's the mechanism to enforce it if you don't have the state? And I don't know the answer. I don't know the answer to that. It's not like a rhetorical question.
Right. I mean, I would say that decentralized anything is probably going to be a little bit better in terms of not, you know, taking out everything all at once. When you compartmentalize, then you have a little bit more control over things. You know, a huge problem in one area doesn't necessarily affect all of society, which is why having separate power grids and different backup sources like that is important. Yeah, I guess I understand all these fears. It is a little there. The part to me that's a little lacking is like what to do about it. We've kind of touched on like if you get left behind, if you don't adopt new technology. You know, we touched on how great it would be if people were responsible consumers, and then that could direct it properly. But generally, when there's, you know, this caution, you know, this cautionary tale around AI, I feel like there needs to be like a solution to it. Or is it just, or are you guys just kind of stay away from it, you know, because of all the things that could happen?
Yeah, I think because of the point we're at with it developing so quickly, you know, there isn't a silver bullet solution, because the technology is going to continue to evolve, and we're going to see more and more examples of it being exploited by these bad actors in government. So it just comes down to checks and balances, because all we ever see is government expanding their power, their remit again and again. You know, they've completely forgotten, well, I don't think they've forgotten, they just don't care that they no longer serve the people. They just serve to enrich themselves. But you know, I'll give you an example of something that made me laugh. A video I can send to you. Maybe you can throw it in somehow on this. And this is, I think this is in Oxford with this 15-minute city pilot. So they put up a bunch of cameras, and there was this guy with a wireless, a cordless angle grinder, and he just started sawing the lamp post off. And there's someone filming him from the window, like cheering him on, saying, "Yeah, do it, cut the camera down." So, you know, that's an example of the people just taking matters into their own hands. And I know you said before, Joe, we've already had CCTV cameras forever, yes, but the CCTV analytics was very much in its infancy 5 years ago. So I think that's a really good example of the people just rejecting it outright. They don't want to have a bunch of cameras that have got facial recognition technology and license plate reading technology all around their suburbia in their residential neighborhoods. And I hope that we see more of that. People just standing up to the tyranny.
This made me think of another point I meant to make. A big trend I see forthcoming is that AI will eventually replace nearly all human labor. Some industries will go, I mean, it's not going to happen overnight, obviously, but eventually it will. You know, some industries will go quicker than others. Like content writing, for example, like ChatGPT is probably not, it can't replace humans yet because it's too like creating like content specifically tailored to like a client's interest with like, I don't know. It seems like ChatGPT isn't that great at doing that yet. But it as the technology evolves, it will be. And it's not just, it's virtually every industry. You know, trucks will be driven by AI. That technology already exists. Anything you can imagine will probably at some point be able to be done more cheaply and more efficiently by machines. And right now, you know, I think we're all aware that there is like, I call it a corporate state, but there's like a technocratic multinational elite that sort of view like the peasants as an inconvenience to them. And the only real leverage that the average person has is that the collective labor of the peasants is still necessary for the economy to run. But what happens when it's not necessary anymore? And there's really no justifiable reason for the overlords to allow all of these people to go on, breathing and exhaling carbon dioxide. So what happens?
Eaters.
The useless eaters.
The implication of this is that we should maintain our slave status because at least they need us then, and they won't completely exterminate us.
Well, it's not ideal. Obviously, I'm not saying we live in utopia now, but it is the only leverage that keeps them from exterminating the whole human race.
Well, I don't think that's the only leverage. I think individuals are actually pretty powerful. I think that throughout history, you've seen, when people tried to do terrible things, a lot of them got their heads chopped off or ended up with magnificent downfalls. Are the bad guys always punished? No, but a lot of times they end up, blowing their brains out or being torn apart by a mob. So I think that individuals are more powerful, but more importantly than that, I think that technological progress, automation, is a really important way to free up people's time. So, if you have an overlord who controls all of the labor on Earth and they no longer need that labor, so they kill all their laborers, I understand that that would be a concern, but I don't think that's the way the world works, especially today. I think that individuals have the power to own the means of production, to have to use the technology to their own advantage. And with that power means that when our time is freed up, when our labor is freed up, it's not for the overlord, it's for ourselves. And so then we can do more productive things or more enjoyable things with our time. So if you could have an automated farm outside that provides everything you ever needed for you, what are you going to do with your time? That's more of a philosophical question. But in the past, not having to work a factory line or not having to work, 12 hours a day in the field has led to ages of enlightenment and creativity and more human progress, a higher standard of living. I see AI replacing human jobs as the exact same thing. Now, the only part that is different is that it's going to replace some jobs that people like to do. Because I think that's where people draw the line, is they go, well, but what about artists? Artists enjoy being artists. So if AI replaces them, that's a problem. Is AI that generative? Like, can it go beyond what is put into it? Or is it all basically limited by programming? So once you put the inputs in, sure, it can mix them around and it can give you things that sound like it's creating stuff, but it's all based on what it's consumed. So you end up, I think the biggest scenario, or the biggest fear wouldn't be that it replaces and goes beyond human creativity. It would be that it stems human creativity and never goes beyond 2023 because everybody is just depending on this endless loop of AI that's just feeding off of itself and not actually gaining anything else.
Yeah, I
think
go ahead, Nick.
All right, I think what you both just said sets us up to segue into the transhumanism with what would our would-be overlords do with us? How much would they cull us? And I'll tell you about that in a moment with Biden's executive order and the bioeconomy. But another thing that I think is important to talk about, and a little bit more lighthearted with the AI, is you talked about art being generative, and we've talked about how it might wreck relationships with ChatGPT. So there's a funny article on Zero Hedge, again, I think it was about AI being used within porn and within photography for models. And it's really divided people. So there were these creators from OnlyFans, I think it was. Some of them were saying, yeah, it's fine. I just took a load of pictures of myself and other models, and then I fed it into the program, and it generated new models. It's pretty hard to tell the difference in the pictures.
And you really studied it. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, scrutinized it, went down the rabbit hole. But I think that's an interesting one, because that again, where it segues into ChatGPT 4 with creating media and films, TV series, which are still all part of the arts in a way. And so I wonder how mainstream that will become, and if people will still, does it even matter if they won't be able to tell the difference, if it's still entertaining with the scripts and the content they put out. But I just thought that was an interesting one to mention, that's bubbling away in the background.
It's interesting, the concept, like Joe was asking, like, rhetorically, if AI can be generative. I'll be interested to see like what AI has to teach about what human consciousness actually is, because some people could argue that, all right, so like the current state of AI, like Joe said, is, you put in all these inputs and it sort of like synthesizes them and, spits out something that's like seemingly novel, but it's really just a synthesis of various influences. But I mean, people could argue that's really what human consciousness is itself, is, you just have all of these inputs. And there's this really good book by Mark Twain that I read when I was a teenager called What is Man? And it's from his later life, when he got really, really cynical after I think both of his daughters died, or maybe it was just one of his daughters and his wife, and he got pretty dark. And it was like a treatise on what man is, like what makes him up. And it's like he goes into this discussion. The whole thing is framed as a discussion between like a young idealistic man who, sees the best in humanity and sees like all of its potential, and like an old jaded man who I guess is really Mark Twain, who says, humans are basically just a machine, that they have all these influences, and really any action at any certain point is only the synthesis of all of these influences. There's really no such thing as free will. I don't know what the answer is, but it's like an interesting philosophical.
Well, that is interesting. And to give it another perspective, I think it was Isaac Newton who said that he was only able to get as far as he got, understand the things that he understood by standing on the shoulders of giants. So to me, there's kind of a fine line between the cynical nature of being like, we're all just robots repeating what we've heard, and being like, there's something about the human mind that is complex enough to put these things together and add something else. Otherwise, we wouldn't have ever progressed beyond cavemen. So we're not obviously going to get to the bottom of what is consciousness in this conversation. I'll just say maybe I'm wrong that AI can't be generative in the same way that humans can be, in which case I definitely see it getting to the point where, there's a new life form on Earth that you have to compete with, which could be very bad for humanity. And Nick, you mentioned that this kind of brings in the whole transhumanism thing. I don't know if everybody knows what transhumanism is, and maybe I'm included there. So I don't know if either of you want to start in on that subject or kind of give us an overview.
Yeah, sure. I'll start. And just one closing remark for the consciousness. I think it'd be great if we could do a different podcast and really explore that. Again, going to the plant medicine, which I think is the opposite of AI. I think AI is going to make things easier. It's going to replace jobs, automation, but it's not going to expand consciousness. It's going to become sentient itself, for sure. But as Vladimir Selenko said in this Never Again is Global documentary, drawing the parallels between the run-up to the Holocaust and what we've been living through in the last few years in the scandemic. He said, and I'm paraphrasing, he said, the only thing that can save humanity is global expanded consciousness. I completely agree. But if we talk about transhumanism, I draw your attention to a very interesting document from a government think tank called Policy Horizons. So this is a Canadian government think tank. I think this came out in 2022, and it gives some fascinating definitions of what biological and digital convergence is. So it says there's three ways that this is emerging. The first one is full physical integration of biological and digital entities. The second is co-evolution of biological and digital entities. And the third is conceptual convergence of biological and digital entities. And it goes on to talk about robots with biological brains and biological bodies with digital brains, and how they want to build on that. But it all reeks of being very anti-human. It's as if they want to get rid of Homo sapiens as we are in our current form, eliminate us. And then we're looping into what Ben said with the mRNA injections. You know, in the words of James Corbett from CorbettReport.com, they are just the thinnest edge of the wedge. This will eventually involve the wholesale transformation of humanity into something else entirely. And we don't know what that is. All we know is that governments can mandate this forced injection with unknown biomedical technologies in the name of a health crisis.
Well, the mRNA is like a really basic first step to transhumanism. It's the injection of foreign genetic material into your body, which is then assimilated, and it produces the spike protein that theoretically, kills the COVID virus, although it's not very efficacious anymore. But yeah, that's what it is, foreign genetic material, piece of technology that's meant to interface with your like inherent biology and then produce something therapeutic.
So once again, this seems like there's some sort of limit, like there's some sort of line that you want to be drawn between, what's okay and what's not. I assume cataract surgery, inserting an artificial lens into the eye, is acceptable. But perhaps I'm wrong. I would assume that, for example, Neuralink, where you actually connect into the brain, say it was to solve blindness, where you have an artificial eye, can connect it into the brain, and this person can see again. Is that too far on the transhumanism scale, or am I getting this wrong about what the actual problem is?
That's a great point. I knew you would take us there, the old devil's advocacy, but the sort of things that appeal to people's humanity or to help people with neurodegenerative diseases, right? That's how they get you. That's how the Trojan horse comes in, with these interfaces with the brain. So that's an interesting one in itself, because Ben talked about Aldous Huxley's Brave New World at the beginning of the podcast. And in Brave New World, you've got all these different sets of people that are literally bioengineered in tubes. And they have different levels of intellect, and they have different roles within society. And he was pretty on the money, I guess, with the way things are heading. So what I think it could look like, if or should we say when, these brain chips come to pass, will they even get mandated? Who knows? They could give you increased intelligence and then take it away. They could give the serfs an added level of intelligence in order to complete a given task for a few hours, and then they could dumb them down again, and they go back to their serfdom. So that's the way I see how how insane it could get with the level of control that the state would have over everyday people. How about you, Ben? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it occurred to me while you were talking. I think my problem is I read way too much dystopian science fiction when I was younger, and it totally jaded me.
Yeah, worst case
Yeah,
scenarios on the brain.
yeah. But I do think my skepticism is borne out by practical. I mean, the last 2 years. Okay, let me put it this way: if the last 3 years or so didn't fundamentally change, or at least influence how you think about this stuff, there's something like deeply wrong with you.
You're such a conspiracy theorist.
Yeah.
I think that it definitely, should have woken a lot of people up to the way that the government will misuse every tool that it could ever get its hands on to accumulate more power and oppress the people. I think it's been doing that for thousands of years, since, probably since the dawn of humanity. Sharpened rocks were the first thing that they probably used to oppress people. And I just wonder if there's people saying that without those sharpened rocks, that everything would be fine.
Well, the problem is, as Nick said previously, it's the scale, it's the capability. Yes, governments have and forever will probably use whatever tools that they have at their disposal. The problem is like that AI, as it develops, it'll open up entirely new possibilities of maintaining social control that previously didn't exist. So like, if you look at like the danger of like a government monopoly on sharpened rocks versus, the 15-minute city where you're under constant surveillance, everything you eat is monitored. At the World Economic Forum, this guy, I think from Pfizer, was talking about this thing they're developing where it's like nanoparticles inside of your intestines, and they like detect when you've taken a medicine that you've been prescribed, and then it reports back to the company or to whoever.
Yeah, I've seen
and
that.
so they can make sure that you've taken whatever drugs they've mandated. So
Yes.
like, as Nick said, like as we get further along, the possibilities for them to develop new ways to control the peasants will just multiply. It'll be like exponential,
Yes, and the possibility for the peasants to fight back will multiply and be exponential as long as we have the technology in our hands as well. For example, the colonists who were fighting the British when they, invaded Massachusetts in 1776 or whatever, had better guns than the British. Personally, if we could own machine guns. Biden likes to say you need F-16s and machine guns. It's like, fine, whatever technology the government has, I should have. And
what about nukes? What about nuclear weapons?
Nukes is a little bit of a different argument, right? Because it's not a precision weapon. So like in the self-defense argument, it's like anything that I could use for self-defense. Can you possibly use a nuke in self-defense? I don't know. Now, should you have the technology available to make electricity? I mean, I kind of think so. Again, the potential for misuse, like, is it more likely that a random individual would end up using that technology to destroy humanity than in the hands of governments? I don't know. But in general, like, I don't think either of you would. Well, maybe you would. I don't know. Arguing that like certain technology should stay out of the hands of individuals and in the hands of government seems like a little bit of a departure from all of our positions about who the biggest threat is right now.
Go ahead, Nick. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, I think that it's futile to assume that we couldn't get the same technology, because there'll always be black markets, there's always pushback. But I want to focus on something else, because I think you just stumbled on a really good point unwittingly. The most powerful weapon on planet Earth It isn't the most powerful machine gun. It isn't about nuclear bombs or energy directed weapons. The most powerful weapon is story. The most powerful weapon is narrative. And I think this is something that we have to absolutely keep at the forefront of our minds. And this is what I hope this podcast and what we write about gets people thinking differently and helps to expand their consciousness. And the reason this is so critically important to understand is because we're having these conversations about brain chip interfaces and whatever else dystopia hellscapes coming down the pipe to subjugate humanity. And you see X number of months, years ahead, and you think, well, how the hell would anybody accept that? There's no way that they would accept that. But they would and they will because of the narrative and the propaganda. So the way it goes with everything over the last 3 years in the mainstream is, you're such a conspiracy theorist, you crazy tinfoil hat wearing conspiracy theorist. We would never do that. We would never do that. And then all of a sudden, they get the rapid response mechanism together, and the next day, the headlines, of course we do that. We've always done that. It's always been like that, you crazy conspiracy theorist. So, like, take the microchip thing. Remember how hard they were going on that in the mainstream media a couple of years ago? And then Sweden started embracing it. There's a bunch of people that are chipped and they can open their apartment, they can pay for things. I remember showing that article, and there was a video to a normie in normie land to see which way the wind was blowing with the sheep. And we'd already had this conversation about the microchip 18 months ago, and he called me crazy. And as soon as I sent him something from the Daily Mail or whatever it was, he looked at me with a catatonic stare with his eyes blinking, and then he said, well, I suppose it is quite good, isn't it? It is quite a good idea. You know, the media is saying it's quite good. It's more convenient. I can open my apartment more easily. And yeah, it is quite annoying. I've got to take my wallet everywhere with my cards. I just thought, yeah, that there are no revelations. Whatever they push, as long as the media spins it as being good and convenient or safe or protective, the normies will just lap it up.
I think the answer to that is clearly the opposition needs to be better at telling stories and using the technology to our advantage. Not all of it. We don't have to get microchipped. We don't think that'll help us. But whatever technology we think will help us to fight back in terms of the narrative should be used. And that actually, to me, there's a lot of dystopian visions of the future, and for good reason. But I think there really is the argument to be made that things get a lot better with the technology in the hands of individuals. And if it's an arms race to outcompete the government, like, is the government efficient and effective and good at spending their money? Or whatever, if it's not the government, the organizations above them. I see humanity winning. I see the good guys winning eventually. And I think that it's hard in the midst of it. We're in the midst of this information warfare, real battleground. We're really in the middle of it. But you see all these signs of the media has that power right now, but it seems like it's coming to an end. And I think it's really important, if you don't want a vacuum of power when it comes to the media or whatever, to start working on those alternatives, those parallels, parallel society, parallel economy, those new businesses and those new ideas and those new stories. That to me is seems to be what the answer to all this is, because it's not going away. These things are going to stay with us. The government cannot be trusted to use it or regulate it. So is that the ultimate answer? Is that we have to understand as much as we can about this, use what is beneficial, reject what might enslave us, and really just get on the right level with talking about these things and sharing these ideas and linking up with like-minded people.
One thing I thought of while you guys were talking about narrative that I think is relevant, it might seem not super relevant to this conversation, is the problem with, all right, a couple of years ago, I wrote an article about Nietzsche who declared that God was dead a couple hundred years ago because he saw the rise of secularism and the rejection of religion. And like the main point he was trying to make is that modern society had stripped people of all of the like the underpinning meaning that religion previously conferred to their lives. It gave them a reason to live. It gave them a reason to hope. It was sort of like a roadmap for life that like secularism can never give. You know, secularism is more just about the absence of God. It's not about. It doesn't say anything about like what the purpose of life is. And I think this has been like cynically weaponized by the media to convince people that there really is no like point. Like if you look at a lot of American media, like Seinfeld is a great example, but it's pervasive in all of pop culture. Like the basic point of Seinfeld is that like life is kind of pointless and like there's not really any meaning in anything. Like none of the characters ever learn anything or like develop as people. Like the whole point of the show is that we're all just sort of like floating around pointlessly. And it was funny in a lot of ways, and it was obviously relatable to a lot of people because that's sort of how they felt already. But in the absence of like really any like purpose to living, it's hard to fight against people that are as motivated as like the World Economic Forum, you know?
Yeah, I guess so. I agree. I think that people do need some sort of meaning. I think that that's one of the things that they try to convince people, like you said, is that there is no meaning, there's no point, and sort of like resistance is futile. Join us or get bulldozed. And I guess, you know, my opinion on that is that I don't think resistance is futile, and I don't think these people are as powerful as they make themselves out to be. Um, I think why don't we're kind of coming up to an hour here. If each of you want to kind of make a closing argument sort of thing, we can leave it at that, and I'll let you guys have the last word.
Yeah, I'll go first. So I really wanted to close on the transhumanism theme by drawing maybe your attention for the first time, I'm not sure, but the listeners, the viewers, to the executive order from Biden, which was on the 12th of September 2022. And this is to institutionalize eugenics, transhumanism. It virtually guarantees that transhumanism and genetic manipulation of citizens will be the main topic of the 2024 election cycle. So I'm just going to read you a closing excerpt from the full EO, which we can perhaps link to in your show notes, Joe.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
People can read through it, and it's a really good article. This from Technocracy News. To sum it up, so here's what they say at the end of this piece. They say, now, for those who are a little skeptical about what I am suggesting, let's just rip the veil off in this closing observation. The term key R&D areas includes fundamental R&D of emerging biotechnologies, including engineering biology, predictive engineering of complex biological systems, including designing, building, testing, and modeling of entire living cells, cell components, or cellular systems. And then it goes on to talk about regulatory science. So it includes all life, including humans. And I've seen other people write about this and speculate that what will happen to us, the serfs, right? So we're tying everything together now. We all get made redundant. We lose our jobs from AI coming into being, as we said before, automation of industries, etc., whatever field or vocation you work in. And then what are they going to do with us, the useless eaters? Well, we're going to become the bioeconomy on the back of Biden's executive order. So you might be harvesting your own blood and your own plasma in order to pay for things. I know that sounds crazy, but this executive order exactly sets things up for that. So people, their body is the economy, it's the bioeconomy. You know, their body becomes a market within itself. So that's as dystopian as things get. And I really hope we can link to that in these notes. People can read through that and just process what that means, because I guarantee you it's going to be popping up in the election for you guys, 2024.
Ben, any closing thoughts?
Well, I would hope that AI and transhumanism would be in the public conversation in 2024. I doubt it will be. I mean, the corporate media has a very, very narrow focus in terms of policy. I mean, I'm sure it'll be in the independent media, but as far as like the media that reaches all the NPCs, they don't really talk about anything substantive. It's mostly just horse race stuff, like who's in the lead today. So anyway, I would like to see that in the public conversation. I don't really foresee that. Yeah, I guess to sum up, my position is like, I'm not, as Nick said, also, I'm not against AI or any technology. It's just about who controls it and the interests that they have, which if there's one lesson from COVID, it's that the interests of the technocrats are not the interests of average people. So, I mean, I wish I had, I think as Joe like mentioned, we're kind of light. I don't have any great solutions. I wish I did. It's going to be a real challenge to try to prevent. I mean, okay, this is what I think. I think the default, if average people don't do something, the default outcome is going to be that we're living on like a digital plantation and we're serfs and we have no rights, and they dictate what we eat and when we eat it and what drugs we take, and you know, our only real value is our biological material, you know, because our labor has been displaced, our labor value has been stripped by AI. So I think that's the default place that we're headed, unless something changes. And again, I wish I had better solutions. I just don't know what the answer is.
Yeah, I mean, that's okay. Obviously we can't solve all of humanity's problems. The point really is, I think, for people to think about it and think critically about everything. Think critically about everything that the government's doing about this technology. You know, don't just accept things, just consider all sides of it, you know. But to that point, I do think that your default may be unfortunately correct, which is so important to not just sleepwalk into that, and to do what you can to fight back, not violently, in my opinion. I think that the way to do that is by forming together with other like-minded people and setting yourself up in a position of strength, so that whatever the future does come to, you can at least tackle it from a position of power. I have a project that is going that's along those lines, trying to get people together, trying to build a nice community that's resilient and can resist this sort of dystopian future. Links below if you're interested in learning more about that. We'll also have links to a couple articles that these guys have written and a couple of the other things that we mentioned throughout the show. So thank you guys for joining me today. This barely scratched the surface of the topic, really. So the other thing is that anybody watching this, please comment below, join the conversation there. And also talk about, tell us what you think should be expanded on, or give us suggestions for another conversation like this. So thank you.
All right. Thanks, Joe.
Yeah, thanks for having me.